All right, and again, Father Andrew, hello, welcome to our seminar, to our lecture series. I really thank you for your time. To welcome my dear guests, all of you. It's my pleasure to introduce Father Peter Farrington, a Coptic priest, a convert to Oriental Coptic Church, and historian and lecturer in early British saints and holy places. And today he is going to talk to us about the coming of Christianity to the Roman Britain, time of a period when church was, unlike unfortunately today, was still one, still unified, still voicing praises to God in one breath, so to say, and legacy that is very important and very interesting, but largely forgotten. So we appreciate Father for his time and looking forward to most edifying talk. And again, thank you very much. If you have some questions for Father Peter, that's most certainly welcome. You are most welcome to send them in chat, or at the end of the lectures, there's going to be some time when you'll be asked Father Peter directly with whatever questions you may have. Thank you, Father Peter. So,
thank you.
I'll make you co-host, and then you can
so I can
share your screen and everything. Mm-hmm.
I have to say, while we're doing that, my view is that the saints of the British Isles of the first 1,000 years, they belong to Christ. They don't belong to any one particular community. And so I value and I venerate the whole history of Christianity in the British Isles for the first millennia. And all of these saints I value most highly. And I do have, perhaps this will be terrible and you'll never want to hear from me again, but I do have other talks on Christianity in the period after Roman Britain, the so-called Dark Ages, and then Christianity in Britain right up to the Norman Conquest. It's a subject I find fascinating, and I do feel privileged to be someone sharing in it. So can you all see my PowerPoint presentation? Yep.
Yes. Yep.
Good. So we're going to be talking about early Christianity in Britain, and we're going to consider in this lecture the Roman period in the time we have together. And I'll just introduce myself very briefly. I'm Father Peter Farrington, and I'm one of the priests serving the Orthodox community in Liverpool. It's a Coptic Orthodox community, and that means that it's the ancient Church of Egypt. And we have many others participating with us in our life, especially Eritreans and Ethiopians. But I very happily welcome members of all Orthodox communities. And I have a very good relationship with the local Roman Catholics and the local Anglicans. I've been a member of the Coptic Orthodox Church for 26 years and a priest for 11 years. And I'm from an evangelical Protestant background. I grew up in an evangelical Christian family that was very devout, and I love the history of the Church of our Lord Jesus Christ. I love all church history, and I love to understand the history of all different Christian groups. And I'm very pleased, though, to be able to speak about, as Father has said, this period in the history of the British Isles when the church was part of that universal experience. Before our sad divisions intruded. The British Isles have had a significant Christian ethos and culture over much of their history, which has really deeply influenced everything. And it's only possible to understand the society in which I live by taking account of the ancient and enduring Christian influence. The Christian history of the British Isles is a shared one. It doesn't only belong to Orthodox or Catholics, it belongs to Anglicans, Methodists, Baptists. And so an understanding of where we have come from, even at second hand, it belongs to those in America and Canada who have family histories stretching back to Britain and to other European countries. But the church of these early times, the saints and holy places associated with them are something that belong to all of us, it seems to me. Because if they are saints of Christ, if they are holy places, hallowed by prayer to Christ, then they belong to all who consider themselves Christians. This is a very interesting artifact. We're going to look at it a bit later on. There's lots of pictures in this presentation. I'm going to try not to talk without having something to look at as well, other than my face. So where do we find our sources of evidence for this early Christian community? The Romans began to occupy the British Isles in the decades before the birth of Christ, and they established themselves in the following centuries. Many British people felt themselves entirely members of the Roman Empire, a little bit as St. Paul did, so that many British people took on various attributes of the attractive Roman culture. Some of them took on Roman names. They began to use the Latin language. They began to build houses that modeled Roman styles elsewhere. And so we should expect that there was an influence of Christianity at the same time as part of that context of the Roman Empire. The Roman occupation in Britain came to an end in 410 AD, when the armed forces stationed in the British Isles were withdrawn to defend the Roman Empire and especially Rome against barbarian invaders. The population carried on as best it could, trying to be Roman and civilized. But we can imagine that in our own context, if all of the supply chain behind supermarkets shut down and closed for some reason, while they still had some stock, you might still be able to get hold of some goods. But after a while, our familiar Western consumerist culture would break down and we would return to a much simpler way of living. And this is exactly what happened in the British Isles. It returned to a more Iron Age culture, even as people were still using Roman names and Latin, as we'll see in some places. But they had to fall back to their Iron Age heritage of farming, living in defended settlements, reducing the quality of all the materials they had available to them. And you'll probably remember that after the Romans left, the Angles and Saxons, the English, pagan peoples from Germany and Denmark began to settle and invade on the eastern coasts. And so this Roman period of life and of Christian experience passed away into history and becomes the subject of another lecture. The sources of evidence we're going to be looking at are documentary, and we do actually have quite a lot of documentary evidence for Christianity in the British Isles in this very early period, more than we might perhaps expect. We're going to look at material evidence of Roman Christianity, and we're going to look at archaeological evidence for Roman Christianity. So throughout the lecture, we're going to be looking at these three different types of evidence to help us see what was the extent of Christianity in Roman Britain, how well organized was it, and can we really say that it was present in a substantial form? Next slide. I'm using two screens, so I just have to make sure I know where my mouse pointer is at all times. There are a variety of Christian legends associated with the British Isles. And sometimes I like sharing these legends with my Coptic Orthodox friends. I'm not sure how much credence I wish to give them all, but I think that they can all be said to be based on some substratum of truth. It has been said, for instance, that the Lord Jesus visited the British Isles with his uncle, Joseph of Arimathea. And Joseph of Arimathea is reported to have been a merchant in the legendary account and to have visited Cornwall to trade for tin. Now, of course, there certainly was trade between the British Isles and the Mediterranean. But this particular legend is late and it was very much developed over time. The idea of St. Joseph of Arimathea coming was earlier than the addition to this legend that Jesus came with him. And the idea that Jesus came with him to Britain was very late indeed and seems to be not really substantiated. But there certainly was a trade between the Mediterranean and the British Isles. Much of the transport network in the earliest period was over water. It was much easier and often much safer being on a ship hugging the shore than going through forests where there might be bandits and thieves and robbers of all kinds. And so we know that it was entirely possible and probable that Christianity came to Britain through these trade routes. And we have a slide showing some of these trade routes in a moment. There is another legend associated with King Lucius, which is described in the Ecclesiastical History of Bede. And it is found in earlier papal records. It's said that this King Lucius from Britain contacted Pope Eleutherius in the 1st century and asked for missionaries to be sent. Many modern scholars believe that this represents a confusion with another known ruler, Lucius of Edessa, who did seem to have contacted Rome in the early centuries. But it doesn't seem to me this is a necessary conclusion. There was no single king of Britain in the early period. Nevertheless, there could well have been a minor British ruler who did make such a request. Nor do we have records of all or even many of these rulers in the 1st century in Britain as Roman influence became more pronounced. So really, it might be entirely possible that some local ruler in one place, especially in southern Britain, contacted Rome and asked that someone would be sent to teach the Christian faith. That was entirely possible. A third legend concerns Aristobulus. He's another figure whose existence is sometimes considered doubtful by modern scholars. The church remembers him as one of the 70 apostles of Jesus, who were sent to become the missionary bishop of the British Isles, or at least some area of the British Isles. It suggested that rather than being sent to Britain, he actually ministered in Bithynia. There does seem a tendency among some scholars to try to deny every piece of evidence and point it in some other direction. It is possible he was the bishop of Bithynia, but it is also possible that he served in Britain in the 1st century as the church reached out across Western Europe. And finally, we have reference to Augulus, Bishop of London. This is found in the Martyrology of Jerome, which is quite early, but the records that we have of that martyrology are a little later, so it may be something that's been interpolated. We do only have later texts from the 6th century, but there is not a great deal of reason to invent an otherwise unknown bishop in Britain. If you were going to add names to a list of martyrs, why would you choose to invent a man called Augulus who died in Britain, so far away from everywhere important in the Roman Empire? So it does seem entirely possible that the first bishop of the Roman city of London was a man called Augulus. These are the legends which are associated with the beginnings of Christianity in the British Isles. They're not very they're not very solid, but they indicate that there was always a sense that Christianity had come to Britain in the 1st century and even in the time of the apostles. And to be honest, this was entirely possible. Here's a slide showing the trade routes, and these trade routes passed through Gaul, which is modern-day France, and they reached the British Isles through various routes. There were trade routes to Cornwall. If you know the map of Britain, Cornwall is the pointy bit on the westernmost side of the south of Britain, and even further up near where I served, near Liverpool, there was an ancient British trading port where materials have been found buried which came from the Eastern Mediterranean. We also have a record in one of the lives of the saints from Egypt in the 7th century, which describes a journey a merchant took to the British Isles. So we know absolutely certainly that there was trade going on from the very earliest period, from the early period of Christianity, right across the empire. And even as I'm looking at this map, I can see the route that St. Ignatius of Antioch, if you know him, the route that he took on his journey to Rome, where he was martyred. Travel was not impossible in the Roman period. And one of the great improvements the Roman Empire brought across Europe was the ease, relatively speaking, of travel and transport. And so it's entirely possible that people came to the British Isles in the 1st century who had a Christian faith and were willing and committed enough to begin to share it. It was a resource-rich region. This is why Britain was conquered by the Roman Empire, among other things. It had many resources that the empire wanted. And we know from material evidence that there was a constant communication of trade and military officials passing back and forth from the British Isles. And so it's reasonable that the first Christians were among these: merchants, soldiers, slaves, government officials, as well as a few missionaries, perhaps. Some of these visitors came even from Egypt, and some British people traveled the other way and left evidence of their travels. We find in many of the writings of the early church fathers, those people who were leaders of the church in the first centuries and wrote down and left us some of their works to the present age, we find Tertullian writing in 208. Tertullian lived in North Africa, around the area of Tripoli, that sort of area. It was the Latin-speaking empire of Carthage. And so Tertullian is a Latin speaker, although he's from North Africa. And he says this in only 208. This is just 100 years after the Apostle John has passed away. In all parts of Spain, among the various nations of Gaul, in districts of Britain inaccessible to the Romans, but subdued to Christ, in all these the kingdom and name of Christ are venerated. Now, it may well be that he is using Britain as an example of somewhere that's about as far away as you can get. And he's saying that even in the most furthest places of the world known to us, there are Christians. But he seems to be aware that there are parts of Britain that the Roman Empire has not yet conquered, which is entirely the case. You may know of Hadrian's Wall, which is one of those barriers, that there were several built to defend the Roman Empire from the wild men of the north. And so there were areas where the Romans didn't establish themselves in any official way, and Tertullian is aware of this. So it seems unlikely he's just using the name Britain to mean somewhere a long way away. He actually knows that there are Christians in the British Isles just a century after the last of the apostles died. Origen is writing just a little bit later from Egypt. Origen is famous as, pardon me, a scholar of Alexandria and then of Palestine. He says, the power of the Savior is felt even among those who are divided from our world in Britain. When, before the coming of Christ, did the land of Britain hold the belief in the one God? Here he's also speaking about how the church has extended itself across the whole known world. But he also, it seems to me, is speaking not necessarily from a personal experience, but from a personal knowledge that Christianity has reached as far as the British Isles in this early period. And then we have the Council of Arles. You probably are aware that from the first centuries, bishops as leaders of churches started to meet together to deal with controversies and problems that they had in common. Some of the first of these councils took place in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, where churches were very close together. The churches named by St. John in the Revelation, the churches that St. Paul visits and speaks to, these are very close together, relatively speaking. And it was very easy for them to start meeting together to thrash out some of the problems they were facing. And in 314, there was a council held in the city of Arles, which is in Gaul, modern-day France, and we have a list of the people who attended. And among those who attended are some from Britain. We have Eborius, the Bishop of York in the province of Britain. We have Restitutus, Bishop of London. We have Adelphius, Bishop in the city of Colchester, Sacerdos, a priest, and Arminius, a deacon. Of course, this doesn't represent the whole of the church in the British Isles. These were the delegates who were sent at some expense and at some difficulty to attend a council hundreds of miles away from Britain. But it does show that there is an organized church in Britain, in the Roman province of Britannia at the very beginning of the 4th century. And it has several bishops who were sent. Some scholars estimate there might have been as many as 50 bishops in the British Isles at this time, caring for relatively small communities in relatively restricted spaces, not in the same way as bishops today might have a diocese of many hundreds of miles. But we see here that it looks essentially like an Orthodox and a Catholic understanding of how the church is ordered, with the bishops, priests, deacons. And there are enough bishops for 3 of them to be sent on a long journey to take part in a council where they are engaged in the life of the universal church. They're not some separate sect on the island on their own. They're playing their part in the universal and united church. Just trying to find my mouse. There it is. And then in 359, I'm going through these in sequential order. In 359, Sulpicius Severus, who is a historian, church historian, he writes, 400 and more Western bishops were summoned to assemble at Ariminum. The emperor had ordered provisions and lodgings to be provided. The Aquitanians, the Gauls, and the Britons, refusing the public supplies, preferred to live at their own expense. 3 only of those from Britain, through want of means of their own, made use of the public bounty. So here we have a record of another council, again requiring bishops and delegates from the British Isles to travel across the English Channel and then make their way across Gaul. And on this occasion, the emperor, who is now a Christian, has made provision that the bishops should have the same sort of resources made available to them that were made available to ordinary government officials. If you were a Roman government official, you didn't have to travel at your own expense. You would be put up at hostels along the way. Depending on your importance, you would have more comfortable lodgings, you would have horses provided for you. And now by 359 AD, the bishops of the church are essentially being considered a level of government official. Not that the church was entirely a department of state, but that was the level of importance bishops were being given. And we read here again that the Britons sent bishops to this council. And 3 of these bishops were not quite so well off, and they needed some help from the Roman authorities. But this seems to me to say that there were others from Britain who had enough means of their own. So certainly more than 3 bishops from Britain attended this council. And it does suggest that, generally speaking, the British Church was doing well enough to be able to send some of its clergy all the way to a council without too many problems. The church is still episcopal. The church is still organized in a way that ties it in with the universal church across Europe. And then we have a passage from Athanasius. Now, you know that Athanasius was the great bishop of Alexandria, and he struggled against the Arian heresy, and 4 or 5 times he was exiled, sometimes to the west, sometimes into hiding in monasteries in Egypt. And in one of his letters, he writes this: "For know, most religious Augustus," and the Augustus is the Emperor Jovian at this time, "for know, most religious Augustus, that these things have been preached from time immemorial, and this faith the fathers who met at Nicaea confessed, and to it have assented all the churches in every quarter, those in Spain and Britain and the Gauls and all Italy and Dalmatia." Now, in his exiles, he had been sent to Gaul. He had been sent to what is the modern-day Netherlands. He would have met British Christians. He would have had not only a personal knowledge in Alexandria that there were Christians in Britain, but he would have had personal encounters with British Christians and other Christians who had visited the church in Britain. And certainly by 363, in the struggle against Arianism, he uses the British church as one example with others of a church that is holding to the Orthodox and Catholic faith and hasn't given way to Arianism and is preserving the Nicene faith. And then we find there's just a couple more of these documentary ones, but they're very interesting and necessary. Some of the material references that we'll look at in a minute are rather sketchy, to be honest, but these writings seem to be quite explicit. John Chrysostom is the famous preacher. Chrysostom means golden tongue or golden mouth. He was world famous as a preacher. He was such a famous preacher in Antioch, where he was a priest, that he was brought to the capital city, to Constantinople, where he became the bishop. Unfortunately, there he fell out with the empress and some of the leading figures in the aristocracy, because he preached a very simple Christianity, or rather a simple way of living Christianity. And he often condemned those who were ostentatious in their wealth. But in one of his sermons, he says, "The Britannic Isles, which lie beyond the sea, have felt the power of the word. Even there, churches are built and altars erected. Whether you go to the ocean or even to the British Isles, you will hear them everywhere teaching wisdom out of the scriptures, in a differing voice, but not in faith, in language, but not in sentiment." And so here, we're coming in 398 towards the end of the Roman period in Britain. The Roman legions left in 410, and in about 450, the Anglo-Saxons began to really make their presence felt in the east of England, near where I live. But in this period, right at the end of the Roman age of Christianity in Britain, we can see that John Chrysostom is aware that the church in Britain is well established, and it is teaching the same faith, following the same scriptures. It uses the language of Britain, although in fact it used Latin mostly. But you could even go to the British Isles, he's saying, and you will find the same Christianity being practiced there, which you find here in Antioch and in Constantinople, in Alexandria and in Rome. And so in this early period, the church in the British Isles is entirely part of this one universal church. It has no sense of being separated. It has no sense of being isolated. It's playing a part as best it can in various councils. Church leaders from the Eastern Mediterranean are aware that the church is well established in the British Isles. Perhaps that's all they know. But it tells us through these documentary records that there was a church in the Roman period, and we can remember that Tertullian speaks in 208. It would be most unlikely for Tertullian in 208 to speak about a church which had only just been established in 207, for instance. It makes sense that the church had been established in the British Isles for 50 years at least, or 100 years, maybe back into the 1st century. Otherwise, it doesn't seem to me that Tertullian would be able to speak of it as being organized in the way that he does. And here at the end of the Roman period, we can see that that same church has a coherent history from the 1st century and its unknown and unknowable origins through the development of episcopacy and organization, involvement in the universal life of the church. And here at the end of the Roman period in Britain, we see it still functioning and still being used as an example in some sense. Vitricius was the Bishop of Rouen in 390 AD, just a couple of years after St. John Chrysostom is speaking. Rouen is another Roman city in Gaul, which is modern France. And he says, "I went to Britain and I remained there for a while. My episcopal colleagues, bringers of salvation, called me there for the sake of peacemaking. I had been serving you in Britain. It was your service which detained me there." So here we see Vitricius has spent some time in the British Isles with his episcopal colleagues. And actually we know, that during this century, there were controversies in the British Isles. The Pelagian heresy began to be influential there. And the Pelagian heresy, sorry, in all of these lectures, you have to use shorthand and be stereotypical. But the Pelagian heresy essentially said, everyone can become perfect and find salvation themselves. God will encourage you, but you don't need God in that sense. You already have everything you need to be able to find salvation within yourself. You already have everything you need. And that troubled the people in the British Isles. That was perhaps their particular controversy. And Vitricius, among other bishops from Gaul, went to the British Isles, spent time with the organized church there, and defended the church in the British Isles against this novel idea, this heresy. In actual fact, Vitricius is speaking these words in a sermon he's giving over the dead body of a dear friend of his, a bishop who has departed. And he's saying in the funeral service, I was away when you died because you had sent me to the British Isles. And that's why I was detained and wasn't here when you departed. But we see here that it seems possible, and it happened, that when there was a problem in the British church, it called upon its colleagues in the Gallic, in the French church, to come over and help. And that actually happened several times with other bishops during this particular century. Just a couple more passages of words, and then we'll look at some other pictures. Gildas is a famous writer and British Christian who lived after the end of the Roman period in Britain, when the Angles and Saxons, the English, are starting to push westwards, are starting to take over and conquer more and more of the British areas. And he writes a work about how the British Christians have deserved this, because the British Christians have fallen into pride, into luxury. They have been treated, especially the rulers, have been treating the people very poorly. And so this is a punishment from God, he writes in a substantial book. But he also looks backwards. And although he's writing in the 6th century, he looks back to the earlier knowledge he has of the church in the Roman period. And he says this about that period. In the 9 years' persecution of the tyrant Diocletian, when the churches throughout the whole world were overthrown, all the copies of the Holy Scriptures which could be found were burned in the streets, and the chosen pastors of God's flock were butchered together with their innocent sheep, in order that not a vestige, if possible, might remain in some provinces of Christ's religion. So he's writing in the 6th century, but he's looking back to the period of persecution under Diocletian in the end of the 3rd century, much, much earlier. In actual fact, in my Coptic Orthodox Church, we begin our dating from the birth of Diocletian, because we consider that it was such a terrible period of persecution, especially in Egypt, that we now calculate the year from the year of the martyrs, from when the period of martyrdom began. And so I can't exactly remember, we don't use it ordinarily, but we use it in the church. It's 17 something or other in the age of the martyrs, which in the Coptic church we count from the time of Diocletian. But here we see, even in Britain, that Gildas is aware of this severe persecution against Christians which happened, and which even had some influence in the British Isles. And we'll see that in this last slide with some documentary evidence. There were kindled up among us bright luminaries of holy martyrs. So he's saying, even in the British Isles, there were some martyrs in this period. Such were St Alban of Verulam, Aaron and Julius, citizens of Caerleon, and the rest of both sexes, who in different places stood their ground in the Christian context. Now, it doesn't seem that there were many martyrdoms in the British Isles. In actual fact, it was often the case that you're probably well aware that the Roman Empire was usually divided into two, and there would be an Augustus or emperor of the East and the West, often with a Caesar who was serving with him, a relative usually. And when one of the Eastern emperors chose to persecute Christians, it was often the case that in the West, this was not adopted so fiercely. And so it seems that there were few martyrs during the Roman period in the British Isles, but those which there were are notable. The first is St Alban, of course, who is the proto-martyr or the first martyr of the British Isles. And there is a town north of London called St Albans, and it is next door to the ruins of the Roman city of Verulam, which is where St Alban lived. And St Alban, very briefly, we'll come to this in a minute anyhow, St Alban was martyred there, and also martyred with him was a priest. Aaron and Julius were from the city of Caerleon, which is usually considered to be the military city over on the Welsh borders. which we can still visit, and the arena is still there from Roman times, where perhaps Aaron and Julius were paraded before they were killed. So there were not many martyrs in the British Isles, but we'll look in a minute at St Alban himself, who made a very significant mark on British Christianity. So that's the documentary evidence. There are other evidences, but I didn't want to spend a whole hour looking at different words. But you can see that very many writers from many different contexts were aware that there was an organized Christian church in the British Isles. Not that there were just one or two odd Christians who had traveled there on business or been taken there as slaves or were stationed there as soldiers, but there was an organized Christian community there with bishops and priests and deacons. And Gildas looks back and sees it as a time when there were churches and there were scriptures. And St. John Chrysostom understands them as having the same scriptures and the same faith. And so St. Athanasius speaks of them having the Nicene faith, as well as those in Spain and Gaul and Egypt and Palestine and Greece. So that's one set of evidence, and it seems to me to be very strong. You can chip away at one piece or another, but it speaks to me, at least reasonably, of an organized Christian church in the British Isles, which to a great extent in the Roman period looked like the church in Gaul, looked like the church in Spain, looked like the church in Italy. They used Latin, and they would have worshipped in a similar way to their brothers and sisters in northern France, for instance, in Gaul. Now, one other evidence, I only have one slide for this, but this is interesting evidence that I find intriguing, is place name evidence. And one of the most important forms of place name evidence for early Christianity is this name Eccles. We have lots of villages called Eccles. We have Eccles cakes as well. I don't know if you know Eccles cakes in America. So there's a little village not far from here where I'm sitting right now called Eccles, and this is a map of it. And I took this from an archaeological database, and this red area here is the area that's been established as having a Roman villa there. So there was a Roman presence here in this village, probably elsewhere as well. But the word Eccles is important because it represents the Latin word ecclesia. And it has come into English use through the British form egluis. And it's not a word that the Anglo-Saxons invented. The Anglo-Saxons didn't call this village Eccles. They called it Eccles because they found something there and they found people there. And the notable building there was an ecclesia, was an egluis. And when they came and said, what's this place? It was egluis. And so many villages are called, many towns are called Eccles in one form or another. And although some represent other origins, it is felt quite reasonably, very reasonably, that these often represent a place where at the end of the Roman period, when the Angles and Saxons were coming in, there were Christian communities there. There was a church building there of some sort, a wooden one, probably, you know, and that made an impression, and that's how the place took its name. You can see that this is a very small village, just a couple of streets. It is a tiny village. And perhaps there was a tiny church there with a small farming community of Christians who came together with a priest. But that was enough for it to retain this name even in the English period, because the English would not have given it this name. They didn't speak Latin, and they didn't use the British terms egluis, but they would have picked up that British name as this is what this place is. It's very interesting to see a map of all of the Eccles. We find them in the east where the Anglo-Saxons invaded, because where there was still a flourishing Christian community in the west, they had other names for their towns. Briefly to speak about the martyrdom of St Alban. St Alban was a Roman soldier. This is obviously a medieval manuscript drawing. St Alban was a soldier. In my own Coptic tradition, we have a great many soldier saints. And in the East, there is a great many soldier saints. and he was a good man, an honorable man. And during this period of persecution, he sheltered a Roman British priest who was running away from the authorities. And while this man was sheltered with him, he saw how he lived. He saw the manner of his life. He saw his religion in practice. And he learnt some of this from the priest. And so when the authorities came knocking on his door, having heard that the priest was sheltered with him, he put on the priest's cloak and he allowed himself to be arrested. And he was a well-known person. And when he appeared before the governor of the Roman town of Verulam, he knew exactly who he was. And he wanted to know what he was playing at. But he insisted that he had become a Christian. And so he was first of all, as was often the case, given many promises of benefit if he forsook this stupidity, and then he was given many threats, and eventually he held firm to his new Christian faith. And so he was led up out of the city, which is at the bottom of a slope in a valley, and he was led up to the top of the hill next door to it, which is now where St Alban's Cathedral is. And there he was executed by beheading. There were miracles associated with that. But from that very early period, the shrine of St Alban, the tomb of St Alban, was venerated by British Christians. And we know that St Germanus, a bishop from Gaul, one of these other bishops, when he visited the British Isles, it's reported in his life that he stopped and offered prayers at the tomb of St Alban. And the shrine of St Alban remained in place until the Protestant change in the country, when it was destroyed and the relics were dispersed and thrown away. But now, if you visit the Cathedral of St Alban, much of the shrine has been built back. They found many fragments of it. And there is a portion of his relics, because his relics had been dispersed. There is a portion of his relics which are kept in the shrine. And so that's a place where for 1700 and years and more, Christian prayer has taken place at the shrine of a hero of the faith. And so he's very important in our own British history. Now we start looking at some of the material evidence. I'm just looking at the time. I'll go quicker. In several places, scratched on the wall in the plaster somewhere, in a ruined house, we found, or they have found, archaeologists have found, a square of letters. Now, one of these was found in Pompeii, and so we know it can't have turned up later from a tourist scratching something on the wall. We know exactly when everything stopped in Pompeii. It was in 79 AD. And so in 79 AD, in the 1st century, this square was being written by people in Rome, in Italy, in the Roman area. This one in Cirencester is probably later, to the 2nd and 3rd century. So the century afterwards, maybe even a little bit later than that. And I'll show you what the words say in a minute, but you can sort of make them out. It does, in fact, say rotas opera tenet arepo sator. Okay. And if we look at the next slide, you can see it laid out properly. Okay. Now, what could that mean? We're used to, in our leisure time, using puzzle books where you have to solve various questions. We're used to having anagrams. The intention seems to be to hide a Christian message in construction of letters that seems to say something else. And these words have been found in the British Isles as well as the one in Pompeii. And this one takes us back to an early period in British history, when still perhaps it wasn't, you didn't write on your house, I'm a Christian, you know, but you wanted a way of letting people know there's Christians in this house, you know. And what they reckon it means is rotas opera tenet arepo sator means in Latin, very roughly, people have struggled to translate it really with different ideas, but it seems to be saying in Latin, the farmer arepo has a plough which he works. So arepo, the farmer, works with his plough or something like that, something innocuous. But when you unjumble the words, you discover that it can take this form. Paternoster, Paternoster, Alpha, Omega, Omega, Alpha. And Paternoster, of course, means our Father. This seems to be what scholars believe that the square can be deconstructed to show. And the context in which it's been found suggests that it's intended to have some sort of a meaning. And this is the meaning that comes out of it. So we know probably that the fish was used as a sign, the anchor was used as a sign. It seems that this word square would also be used as a sign. And maybe if you had a visitor, he just thought it was some words about Arepo the farmer. But someone who understood saw that there was a Christian content to it. And the presence of word squares like this, it suggests that Christianity is established not just at the level of bishops and organization, but people in their houses. This house in Cirencester, where this was found, there were Christians living there who wanted to make a mark that would be understood by other Christians. Now we'll just look at some photos of some other material goods found over the centuries. We're going to start with some physical remains. I took this photo, I've been here, okay? This is a baptistry, a Roman baptistry. You can see how high it is. You could fill that with water and baptize someone in it today, and it's in a ruined state. One of my daughters climbed inside it, and it's big. It's big enough for adult baptism. And a little way on the grass, this is inside a Roman fort, a little way across the grass, archaeologists have found the footings for a wooden church of some size, not a huge church, but of some size. Now, if you were going to, when I baptize people in my own context, if I'm borrowing someone else's church and they don't have an adult baptistry, I have an inflatable birthing pool I use, and I baptize people in that. Now, you only need a substantial baptistry if you are baptizing a lot of adults, This is a Roman fort. There are a lot of soldiers coming to and fro. Around the outside of the fort, there is a whole domestic settlement of wives and children. So this seems to me to represent in the 4th century, in the 300s, a well-established Christian church that was seeing so many adult baptisms, it needed to build a very substantial baptistry. And this is just a few miles away from where I live. I'm very fortunate to visit this. This is another place. I took this photo as well. This is another place that's very close to me. This is a Roman villa. You can imagine what a Roman villa looks like. It's a suite of rooms, there can be wings. This is in fact showing a cellar. Okay, what we see here, all the upper stories have gone, all the ground level has gone. This is a cellar. And you can see there's a niche on the left, in one place on the right, I think there were steps going down into the cellar. It's the cellar, okay? But what they discovered in this cellar were hundreds of fragments of plaster. And when they reconstructed the plaster, this is what they found. They found that in the room above, this had been on the plaster work. This was the plaster work. And you can see it's a very beautiful representation of the Chi Rho, the CH letter from Greek and the R letter from Greek, the first letters of the names of the word Christ. And we can see the A and the O, the Alpha and Omega in Greek. What was above this cellar was a Christian chapel from the 4th century. It was a place where Christians were meeting. And in actual fact, the archaeologists discovered that this wing of a house, it had been a pagan villa, but one entire wing was turned over to be a church, we can say. They even built another door so that people could come in from outside. It wasn't just a private chapel for a few Christians in a family. It was a place where people came from outside to worship. And we actually have a fragment of the painting from another wall in this same room. And here it is considered that these are representatives of the members of the congregation, perhaps especially members of the wealthy family that had constructed it. These are probably not photographs, but intended to be representations of the members of this Christian community. And the one on the left showing here, actually there's a bar going across. It's not that he's on a cross or something. That's representing a veil. And it's suggested by archaeologists that means that this person has departed. We don't know whether these represent priests, the priests who have been here. We don't know whether it represents the family members or bishops or who it represents. But you can see this would have been one whole wall of this very attractive church complex as part of this villa. Again, this is only a few miles from where I live. And then here is another Roman church. This is from Colchester, which is in East Anglia. Around the grass here, they discovered a cemetery. And at one period, the cemetery was a pagan one. But then at a certain point, all of the graves begin to be orientated east-west in a Christian manner. And this building was excavated, which is described as a church building. And it's of some substantial size, not vast by any means, but the cemetery, in fact, contains over 300 Christian burials. And this church here is 20. I don't know what measurement you use in America, so I'll give you both. It's 25 meters or 75 feet in length, and it's 7.5 meters and 22 feet in width. And you can see that there are blocks here indicating where there were pillars in the church. You can see that there's a curved apse at the end where the altar would have been. This looks like the sort of church we would expect from an Orthodox or a Catholic context, even today in some respects. And here it is, surrounded by a Christian cemetery that contains over 300 people. And so for 100 years or so, until the city of Colchester collapsed at the end of the Roman Empire in this region, at the beginning of the 5th century, there was an established church here in Colchester, quite a large church, marrying people, baptizing babies, burying people, well organized. And at some of the councils that we heard mentioned, Colchester was one of the places where a bishop came from. There is another church in the excavation of the Roman city of Silchester. I couldn't get a better picture than this. I think it's been covered up after the excavation. But this also is a Roman church from the Roman city of Silchester. And you can see that it's in basilical form. You can see that there is an apse at the end. There are aisles. It's in a square shape. It's not cruciform. There aren't apses, but it's a square shape, but with an apse at the end. There was a Christian community worshipping in Silchester, and they had enough organization and enough wealth among themselves to be able to build a reasonably substantial place of worship. And we remember that Christianity became legal at the beginning of the 4th century. So when this church was built, it was not about to be knocked down by a hostile persecuting emperor. It was worth investing some money into it. And then we look at some of the material evidence, and I'll go through this reasonably quickly. From Roman London, we have this pottery sherd. On the bottom of this pot, we have, as you can see in the middle, a Chi-Rho. What does this mean? What does it mean for us? Does it mean, was there a large church, a small church? We don't really know. Was this used in a church, or was it used by a Christian? We don't know. But certainly the person who handled this pot marked it at the bottom with a Chi-Rho. There was a Christian using this pot. And either it means that that had some significance. There's no point putting a sign on a pot that no one knows what it means. If you're the only Christian for 300 miles, there's not much point putting a Chi-Rho on it. You know, Chi-Rho must have meant something in the 4th century in Roman London. It meant it belonged to the Christians, or it belonged to this Christian who works with me. And then we have from a Roman villa in Chedworth. There's lots of photos you can see about this, but I focused in on this one. You can see there's a Chi-Rho etched into this stone. Okay, not so clear, but there is definitely a Chi Rho. And this actually comes from part of the coping, part of the stonework around a nympharium, a pool. And in pagan times, this would have been a center of some form of pagan worship. But at some point, the family who owned this villa became Christian. And it's assumed that they turned this into a baptistry. And so they marked the stones of this nympharium with a Chi Rho to show that it had a new purpose. A little later, it appears that the family or a new family came who were not Christian, because this stone was used somewhere else on the site. So it seems as though you might have Christianity in one generation, and then perhaps your grandchildren went back to paganism. But certainly within the Roman villa culture, the elite, there were those who were making their mark, their Christian mark. This is very interesting. You can again just see a Chi Rho here. This is a stone, perhaps a wall or a flooring, and it's from Vindolanda, which is one of the Roman forts on Hadrian's Wall. And it is thought that within the officers' quarters of this Roman fort, one officer had set up a small room as a Christian chapel for worship. And we have to remember that Roman forts weren't just soldiers. They were surrounded by their families, because they would often be away from home a long time. Most of them weren't actually Italians. They were from elsewhere. They would settle down and have families living in houses around the fort. And so it's thought that one of the officers became a Christian, and he established a place where the Christians of the Vindolanda camp could worship. What they also found in the same place, the same context, was this wonderful relic. This is considered to be a portable altar stone. And we have portable altar stones from lots of other contexts going into the medieval period, probably even today. I don't know if Roman Catholic bishops carry portable altar stones, but in the Eastern Orthodox Church, they have antimensions, which allow a liturgy to be taken place somewhere. And in my own culture, Coptic Orthodox culture, we have a board of wood inscribed with the Alpha and Omega, and it's anointed with chrism. So we have something very similar in all of our Orthodox cultures. And this was found in the same place as part of the materials that this Christian community had praying in a relatively simple church at the Roman fort of Vindolanda on Hadrian's Wall. So even in the furthest north, there were Christians. It wasn't just restricted to the elite in villas, nor was it just restricted to slaves who had been brought in from Eastern Mediterranean. We can say that there was an ordinary Christian life going on in that church we just saw in Colchester, the one in Silchester, and even here in a small Roman fort at the edge of the world. This is a ring that was found, and it's a bit hard to make out, but if you can imagine, this is the bit that sits on top of the ring. I don't even know what it's called, but it's a bit like a signet ring. And you can see that there is carvings into the metal, which would have been on the ring that someone would have worn. And that wording says, and you can make it out if you go backwards, Antonius, may you live in God. Antonius, may you live in God. And that phrase, may you live in God, is a Christian phrase. It's not used by other religions at the time. It's found in the catacombs in Rome. It's found in other Christian contexts around the West. May you live in God is a Christian phraseology. And so this was given from a Christian, to Antonius, as a goodwill gesture. And it said, Antonius, may you live in God. And it was lost at some point in the 3rd century in Norfolk. But it again represents ordinary Christian life. An ordinary person wore this and it fell off and got lost. And then we have just a few more slides. Some of the most beautiful stuff, which is in the British Museum in London. This was from a hoard of silver found in Hoxton in Suffolk. And it dates towards the end of this Roman period, still just within the Roman period. And in this hoard, this large collection of materials, which appear to have been hidden, This wasn't lost, this was hidden. And since Suffolk is on the east coast, it's entirely reasonable that as the English started invading, the Christian community in one place decided we better hide all of our stuff, and they were unable to come back and collect it. And so there are many of these spoons and ladles which have been found, and other goods as well. And you can see right where the handle joins the bowl, there's a Cairo, which indicates it's a Christian implement. And there are also dolphins above and below that, which is also a Christian symbology. And what archaeologists believe is that these were used in baptism and then given to the person like a christening gift, you know, just as a baby might receive christening gifts from relatives and friends. This would be given to a family member on their baptism. And so it's thought that's why there were many of them in a collection. It was the family collection of christening gifts that had been received. It's also thought it might have been used for anointing with holy oil. But the fact that there were many of them does seem to suggest that they were something that each person had as a memento of some important point in their Christian life. And then here we've looked at slide 30. Yeah, this is from a different hoard, the Water Newton hoard. And this is immensely important. This is the earliest collection of Eucharistic vessels in the world. There was an advantage in Britain being invaded at the beginning of the 5th century because many of these things were hidden. Whereas in those parts where life carried on, they get worn out, they get remade into something else. So these represent the earliest Eucharistic vessels which we have in the world. And this particular cup, this is from a cup. So it's a little bit taller than it is wide. And it might have been used in communion as a chalice. And it says, Innocentia, we can see Innocentia there, Innocentia and Viventia offered this. And then there's a Cairo on the left there. So it may well be that Innocentia and Viventia paid for something to be made, perhaps a chalice for the communion, and they presented it to the church in their area with their names inscribed on it as a sign of that. And I think I can show some of the other things. Here's the hoard here. And you can see that there is a ladle, a spoon. We still use a spoon in my own church for communion. There is a two-handled jug or chalice. There is a jug underneath where it says material. There's a beautifully inscribed jug there. There's what looks like a pattern in the middle. You know, you could have a liturgy or a mass using these utensils. And so dating from sometime in the 300s, this is the earliest collection of Eucharistic vessels that we have in the world. And the large bowl has inscribed on it, "O Lord, I honor your sacred altar." So it's clearly a Christian set of materials. It's not just domestic use. These are used for the altar service, and these are offered to the church for the communion. So clearly in the area of Water Newton, which is in Cambridgeshire, again in the east side of England, there was a well-organized and wealthy Christian church in the area. And they also had buried these goods when danger threatened, and for some reason were unable to retrieve them. And then just a couple more slides and then I'll be finished. There's not so much material evidence from this period. Here we see evidence from Exeter in Devon. There's very little evidence of Christianity in Roman Britain in Devon and Cornwall. That's the bit sticking right out on the westernmost part of the south of England. And in actual fact, the Romans didn't push that far down. The Romans went everywhere, but they didn't really establish themselves beyond the great city of Exeter, which still remains today. And there's been a pot found in Exeter with, again, you can see a Cairo. It may be that the church right at that edge of the Roman Empire was rather poor, rather small. This again could represent something that was used in the Christian community. Perhaps this was one of the jugs they used for water, or perhaps it belonged to someone who was a Christian. This is in fact the only evidence of Christianity from Devon at the moment. So we have to be very clear, it's not a consistent picture everywhere. There are areas where Christianity makes more inroads than others. But just as we found that there was a Christian community in Vindelander on Hadrian's Wall, it seems at the other end there wasn't much Christian activity in the far west at this period. Although in a second lecture, when we look at so-called Dark Age Britain, Cornwall and Devon explode with Christian activity and become a land of saints. And then my second to last slide is this. It's a ring, and it's on its side because otherwise it would make it too narrow. It's a ring, okay? You can see the ring where your finger would go through, and there's a red jewel or stone that's been carved and set into the ring called intaglio, a hard stone with an engraved image. And it actually shows, if you turn your head, it shows two fishes and an anchor, And exactly the same image appears in the catacombs, carved in the stone, an anchor with two fishes. And the anchor often represented the cross, and the fishes represent Christ. We know that ichthus means Jesus Christ, Son of God. And so here is a ring from the 3rd century, the 200s, that was lost by someone, by a Christian. Only a Christian would wear this. And then finally, the picture I started with, this is a beautiful thing. It's a lead font from Suffolk. Again, Suffolk is on the east. And this is the picture that was in my opening title slide. It is a lead font, and it's not unique by any means. There are others. And you can see that there is a chi rho, and there is an alpha and omega, but whoever has written this has been copying something and has written omega alpha. Okay, so perhaps the person who was tasked with constructing it was not quite as au fait with Christianity as the people that were going to buy it. And I wonder what they said when he presented them with it the wrong way round, or maybe some of them couldn't read either. This would have been used for the baptism of infants. It could have been used for foot washing ceremonies. We still have foot washing in my own Coptic Orthodox church, but it dates again from the 300s in the Roman period, where we can see that there was the possibility of producing very high quality materials, very impressive and beautiful materials, as well as marking just a broken piece of pot with a chi rho. And so that really describes the Christian church in Roman Britain. At the one hand, it was very humble in many places. At the other hand, it could produce some of the great works of cultural material production and artistry of this period. On the one hand, it was very highly organized, and it had bishops and priests who attended councils. On the other hand, perhaps someone took a bowl to their work and they had a chi rho on it to show it was theirs. You know, it was both things at the same time, organized and simple, highly cultural, and yet also present among the ordinary people. And as we've seen, most of this stuff is found in the East. In actual fact, Christians were especially present after the English invaded in the West. And that's where a second lecture I have looks especially at that period, the age of crosses, the age of manuscripts, the age of saints traveling from Ireland and Wales and Cornwall to Brittany. But in this age, we can see that nearly everything that we've been looking at of greatest value was buried away as the invaders came ashore on the East Coast. And it's due to that disruption of the life of the church that we have this material evidence to examine today. I hope some of that was interesting. And I hope if you have some questions, I can provide some words of usefulness. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Father, this is absolutely superior and by far exceeded my high expectations, I have to say. It's thank you so much. I don't know how to appreciate it. It's just absolutely wonderful. I even as lecture was going on via Facebook, I received a number of requests from people from Russia who were not able to attend because it's too late, but they asked me if the lecture could be available, the record of it could be available and posted, which of course I'll promptly do. Father, I do have a few questions,
Yes,
if I may. But I encourage all of our listeners, to come forward and ask any questions. Do we have any material evidence of early Christianity from more remote provinces of Wales, Cornwall, or outside of Hadrianic Wall? Nothing have been found to date, and we just may speculate if any Christian presence was outside the main Roman cities and villas within the, so to say, heartland of Roman control.
Good question. The fact is that if we take Wales as an example, most people didn't want to live in Wales. Wales isn't the best place to live. It's mostly mountains and it rains a lot, so most people wanted to live in the fertile farmland of southern and central England. The only reason that Christians moved west into the more difficult land was because the Angles and Saxons were pushing in always from the east. And so early on, Christianity was in the best lands. The Roman villas weren't on mountaintops. The Roman villas were farming estates, and so you wanted good green farming land. The Christianity which we then find in Wales and in more remote places in Scotland is the Christianity of the next period, when Christians have been pushed to the side and they have to try and continue their Roman civilized life as best they can in much more difficult circumstances. In the same way, Ireland isn't evangelized until 430, that sort of period. So we don't start to see Irish missionaries coming until much later, and so again, you must talk among yourselves, but if you are ever interested, I do have a second lecture on this second period, which is when some of the most beautiful material from Christianity in the British Isles is found. The manuscripts of the Book of Kells, the stone crosses, but these are all after Roman Christianity has been pushed to the side. The area of Brittany in France, if you know the area of Brittany in France, Brittany means Little Britain. And the reason it's called Little Britain is because so many British people emigrated across the English Channel to escape the Angles and Saxons and to establish themselves there. And there was a constant back and forth of bishops and missionaries and saints from northern France to England, to Wales, to Scotland, to Ireland. The sea made travel very easy. And so all of these places you've mentioned, they don't have an early Christian presence in the Roman period because no one really wanted to live there. It's only when that's where you have to live that we start to see monastic settlements. We start to see, we speak of St. David. We speak of all of the Welsh saints, all of the Cornish saints, hundreds and hundreds of saints, but they all come second after the Roman Empire has collapsed. There was some continuity. In the West, essentially, Roman Christianity carried on as best it could. But in the East, imagine our countries were invaded by a hostile power, and as we have experienced in the last 100 years, and nearly all of the bishops are eliminated. Priests have to hide, I can think in British terms of the penal period when Roman Catholic priests had to hide and there were no Roman Catholic bishops in England. It's very hard to keep the church going underground. It did happen to some extent, but it was in the West, outside of the English influence, that Christianity really flourished, and then began to influence the pagan English. Sorry, I go on when you ask me a question.
No, that's fantastic. That's fantastic. Dear friends, please, if you have questions, please turn your microphones on, and you're most welcome to ask Father Peter any questions you want, as I obviously have wealth of knowledge.
I hope some of that was interesting to you all. Yes, sorry.
I've read, 4 years ago or so about a rabbit hole that was excavated, and this may have been from this later period you're talking about, where and they found a chapel, a Christian church underneath.
Yes, yes.
Down the rabbit hole.
Yes. That in fact is Lullingston Roman Villa, what's downstairs? Sorry, my mind has gone blank. Cellar. Where that cellar was, where all the plaster had fallen down. Yes, that was entirely it. They found some fragments, just the farmers' workers, you know, and then they uncovered this Roman villa, and then they found all of these fragments of plaster, and archaeologists took for so long to piece them together and find this beautiful plaster work. But that tells us archaeologists are well aware of how little has been preserved. You know, imagine that all of us were worshipping as Roman Christians and we had constructed a wooden church. What would survive after 2,000 years? It would be very hard for archaeologists to come along and say this was a church. So it takes a particular set of circumstances for us to find something that we can say definitely this was a church. But Ken Dark, who is a scholar of this period, who I've spoken to, he estimates that there were perhaps 50 bishops. You know, every major Roman town, city, you know, certainly had a bishop, and maybe one, you know, like in the New Testament, with just maybe one or two congregations. But it was a well-organized church in the same way as Gaul. But it suffered because the English invaded and interrupted that life. Whereas in Gaul, that didn't really happen. And so in Gaul, in France, you can visit some places in France where the church is essentially built on the Roman church, and it's just built over it. Where in England, that was much harder. What I do notice is, for instance, Lullingston Roman Villa, there was clearly a church as part of this Roman villa. And the very first English church, Anglo-Saxon church that was built about 50 feet away from it, you know? So it really makes sense that there was a continuity of some sort, some sense of history over 100 years or so, you know, between the end of this building and the decision to build a new church here and not anywhere else, you know. I think that happened a lot. Maybe it was a folk memory for 100 years, you know. Maybe people like in Soviet Russia, in other places, were doing the best to keep Christianity going among their family, you know. But I think there was some shadowy continuity between the Roman period and the English church, which began 100 years or so afterwards.
Thank you. And what's very fascinating is that some of the earliest material Christian evidence outside of Middle East and Italy actually comes from England. Like you pointed out to the Eucharistic set, as you pointed out to the frescoes, you know, Domus Ecclesia, there are only 3 or 4 of them that have been identified as such, and which at least some material evidence preserved, not only upbuilt and built on top of. And of course, Lullingston Villa comes to the forefront. This is very fascinating. You know, you wouldn't expect it, that something like that would come out of England.
It's only 20 minutes away from me. I'm very lucky, and I'm only 20 minutes from Canterbury. I am 50 minutes from Richborough Roman Fort. St. Augustine, who brought the faith to the English, not to England, to Britain, but to the English. He landed just down the road from me. You know, when you start digging in Europe, you know, you start to uncover so much valuable history. Sorry, you had a question, did you?
Well, actually, I should have looked this up before your lecture, but I think it's in one of Paul's letters, and I think it's Romans, where he sends greetings to the other Christians, to the Christians in Rome, to the Christians from Rome. Don't remember, from Pudens and Claudia.
Yes.
And the author of this article said that there was some kind of inscription that was found in Britain that Claudia may have been a British princess that married Pudens.
Yeah, there is a whole at one extreme, there is a whole industry around controversial history, put it like that. You know how people can make a world out of anything, you know. But undoubtedly, I mean, I hesitate to even call them legends, you know, but undoubtedly, there were British people who were taken captive to Rome, who became slaves in important Roman households, you know. Some of them have the same names, you know. It's entirely reasonable that some Britons brought to Rome heard the Christian message, and some of them accepted it, you know. And that then had an influence back home in Britain, you know. I hesitate to put too much weight on any of these stories, but I don't dismiss anything, but I don't wholeheartedly accept it, if you know what I mean. I'm quite happy living with those two things in my head, you know. And on the one hand, I'm happy to have these. It seems to be a folk memory, you know, that Christianity has been in Britain very early. And we can see from even some of the written evidence, it was certainly there by the end of the 100s when Tertullian was speaking. And some of the material evidence is from the 100s, you know. If we've only found things from the 100s, the chance of that being the very first, imagine that square of words, of letters, which is perhaps from the 100s. If that was the very first Christian who ever lived in Britain who wrote that square, that would be very unusual for us to have discovered it, you know. There must have been other people, and then before him, you know. You don't put a sign up saying you're a Christian unless there are other Christians in that period that you want to know that you're a Christian, you know. Having the sign of the fish isn't very useful if you're the only person who knows what the sign of the fish is. So all of this pushes back earlier and earlier, the period when Christianity came to Britain. And it makes sense. If St. Paul did manage to go to Spain, we know that Christians were in France, in Gaul in the 1st century, you know, so it's entirely reasonable. Britain and Gaul were connected at that time, you know. The English Channel wasn't a dividing line. It was an easily crossed means of communication. So anything that we find in Gaul, very, very likely we will find it in Britain, because they were neighbors, cousins, you know, brothers and sisters. So I think all of these stories, which we find in fragmentary form in later Welsh legends and things like that, I think they're all looking back to the fact that Britain was Christian in a way very early on. You know, there were Christians in Britain very early on, but it was never Christian. It was never entirely Christian. We mustn't overestimate the influence of Christianity in Roman Britain. There were still pagans. There were still pagans building small temples in the same way that Christians built small churches. But certainly it had bishops, many bishops, it had priests, it had deacons, it had beautiful Eucharistic vessels, you know. It was living a traditional Roman Catholic Orthodox type of Christianity from the very earliest period. And to see these things for yourself in the British Museum, you know, as a Christian, you know, it's nice enough to see things as a British person, but to know that these are like the vessels I use as a priest, you know, and they have the same intent. That really makes me feel a connection with them. Thank you so much. And thank you, Father, for giving me the opportunity of speaking.
Sure. Father, one more question,
yes,
maybe
of course.
Slightly on a different manner. Prior, say, to second part of 19th century, where there are different scholarly works published on early Christianity in the early 20th century, how strong were awareness of early presence of Christianity in Britain? I know, of course, everybody knew about Bede and such, but within the, say, Anglican Anglican mind, or even Roman Catholic for that matter, was it of an importance to have such an early connection to the sites, like it was in Italy or somewhere else?
Much of the landscape was excavated later rather than early. There were still important Roman remains, you know, but no sense that they were Roman churches. There were Anglo-Saxon remains, but even in the 17 and 1800s, a historic Anglo-Saxon church might be knocked down easily to have a new church built in its place. There wasn't really that value of the historical. What was most important was that Britain in the 19th century was very, very anti-Catholic in a way that's almost impossible to comprehend for me as someone living now. In my own town where I'm sitting now, when Catholicism was made legal again, every time the Catholics tried to buy a house to have as a place of worship, Protestants would buy that house at a higher price to prevent them. It took them a long time to find somewhere to worship. And so when people started looking at the early church in Britain, what they wanted was to show that the early church was not Catholic, and that it was a special church that was mostly like them, but especially it didn't look towards the Pope. It didn't have bishops and priests. You know, it was much more congregationalist. And so that was how the early history of the church in the British Isles was used in the 19th century as a form of anti-Roman Catholic polemic. On the other hand, that was a very important role. So everything you read about the early church, if I go onto archive.org, lots of 19th century books about the early British church will be insisting that it wasn't Roman Catholic. That's the main thing. The other angle was it became a vehicle for romanticism. And so people looked back at the early British church and they had these romantic ideals. The early British Christians were essentially hippies, or they were druids, you know. They certainly they weren't into bishops, priests and deacons with the mass or the liturgy. You know, they spent their time floating around the hills, communing with God. So there were these two fake views and uses of the history of the early British church. One as a Protestant polemic, and the other really as an not quite anti-Christian polemic, but it was developing a sort of romantic spirituality. And the idea was that when the English church started under Augustine, you know, this was a loss of this pristine communion with God that everyone had enjoyed without institutional Christianity. So even into the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, you will still find a load of rubbish written about the early British church. Not so much the anti-Roman Catholic polemic at all, but every crazy idea to suggest that they weren't really Christians in the same model as the rest of the church. They were really druids and hippies and Celtic, you know. In actual fact, the Christianity of the British Isles in this period was exactly the same as that across the English Channel. They worshipped in Latin, and you could have gone from a church in Rome to a church in Britain at that time and essentially had the same service. So there was much that was wrong about the earliest understanding of the British church. Thank God a lot of the early texts were translated, such as Bede. Bede is an immense giant of a man in Europe. Whenever I do Bible studies, I'm always quoting from Bede because he always has something wonderful to say. He was so well educated, and yet he lived all of his life in a small monastery in Jarrow in the northeast of England. But he was perhaps the greatest brain of his time, with a spirit to match. When the English history became available in English, much of the early pages are also legend and false. You know, I don't believe the British people came from Troy, for instance, as the English history suggests, and that Britain is named after Brutus, you know, a Greek hero. I don't believe that either. But his more recent contemporary history is full of interest. And slowly in the last decades, really, that's been more and more the focus. There's lots of very academic and scholarly work on the early British church, lots of good archaeology. I organized a conference a couple of years ago, the Archaeology of Early Christianity in Britain, and I engaged some leading scholars to come and speak about what we know about the early church in the British Isles. And it's becoming much more scholarly and much more robust and built on a much stronger foundation. But as everything that isn't quite in focus can be used for other people's ambitions and aims, you know. And so to understand this history better prevents us falling into either of these two false uses of this history. Sorry, when you ask a question, I can't stop.
No, that's excellent. That's absolutely marvelous. Thank you so much.
God bless you all. That's been a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Father. And we hope to see you again, if you don't mind, at some point.
No, I have another one I'd love. You're a very appreciative, intelligent audience. I have another one later on when you've forgotten how terrible this was, maybe you'll invite me back for the next stage in the history of early Christianity.
Consider it's
God bless
done.
you all. Thank you,
Thank you,
Father.
thank you, thank you. Please pray
Take
for us,
care.
Father. And
God bless
stay
you all.
healthy and well. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you all. Dear friends, again, thank you for coming. We'll try to continue offering our lectures in English on Sundays. So if you'd like to come, please, you're most welcome to do so. I'll be posting announcements about the upcoming lectures on my Facebook page. So if there are any suggestions or questions or anything else, please, you know where to find me. And of course, certain pleasure to see you all, and hope to see you next week. Announcement about the upcoming lecture will be posted, as I said, in due time. Okay, and recording of this lecture will be available on YouTube, and the link to it also will be posted on Facebook. Records of all our former lectures, although not that many in English, but some are quite good. On my YouTube channel, it's under my name, Ilya Gotlinsky, ILYA GOTLINSKY, and there are all in all about 60 lectures there. So, thank you.